I'm Nikki Weiner, the Vice President of the senior class, and I'm now going to turn it over to Stephanie Fernandez, the President of the senior class. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here. So good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Fernandez, as Nikki said, and it's great to be here today to introduce President Spar. In the 5 years she has been at Barnard, President Spar has led numerous initiatives within the field of women and leadership at the national level and at the global level. This includes spearheading initiatives for the Athena Center for Leadership Studies and the Global Symposiums, amongst others. Prior to joining us at Barnard, she was one of the first female professors at Harvard Business School. In the past, President Spar has published 4 major books along with countless articles and publications. Today, President Spar will be talking about her brand new book, which Nikki mentioned, Wonder Woman, Sex, Power, and the Quest for Perfection. Although the next few weeks will involve a lot of media and events surrounding Wonder Woman, President Spar has decided to make her first appearance with the book to students, in other words, to us all, before anybody else hears about it, which is particularly exciting. The topics within the book affect each and every single one of us, as sooner or later, we will have to face the reality of joining the workforce, something that is especially true for all my fellow seniors in the audience. Wonder Woman is bound to generate discussion here on the Barnard campus, but also at the national level. It is a very exciting time for the college, as Barnard has always been a fierce leader around national discussions pertaining to women and feminism. Without further ado, President Spar.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you, Nikki. Thanks to all of you for coming today. I know this is a class time and you've got lots going on in your lives. So thank you for being here today. As Stephanie just said, this is the first time I'm speaking publicly about the book. So it's a little scary for me because you might all tell me you don't like what it's about and then we'll have a bad week. But more importantly, it really gives me a chance to throw these ideas out. I'm not going to talk for too long, and so we're really going to try and leave time for Q&A. So feel comfortable. Anything goes. Anything's fine. And I'm really, really curious in how you respond to the book and to some of its major themes. So the book is a bit of a hybrid. I was just talking to a reporter earlier who said, well, how would you categorize it? And I said, that's actually one of the harder questions you can ask me about the book, because it's really a combination. It's partly a cultural history. It's partly social analysis. There's a fair amount of data in it. As a former economist, I couldn't resist putting data into it. But it's also, in large part, a personal story. And so that's what makes for this hybrid quality of bringing together the data piece and more personal stories than I actually intended originally to put in the book, but they somehow just kind of managed to sneak in there. And what I'm trying to do is to examine the status of women today and asking sort of the basic question of how far have women really come since the feminist and sexual revolutions, and why we still appear to have such a long way to go. But what makes the book, I think, a little bit different is that I'm really asking these questions and telling these stories through the personal perspective of women of my generation. And it's not just that women of my generation have a particularly interesting part to play in this story, it's what I know. So I'm telling the story through the lens that I think is easiest, which is really the life that I've experienced and that women of my age have experienced. So I was born in 1963. One of the odd things about writing this book is that everyone in the world now knows how old I am, so I can never fake that anymore. And if you just remember sort of your relatively recent history, being born in 1963 means that by the time I entered middle school, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, Martin Luther King had been assassinated, the Cuban Missile Crisis had unfolded, Woodstock had come and gone, the Vietnam War had come and gone, Roe v. Wade had been decided, the sexual revolution had occurred, and the feminist revolution had occurred. So it was a very packed 10 years in social terms. And I was too young to participate in any of it. So these were things, if you can remember, things that happened to you between the time you were born and the time you were 12. You're kind of vaguely aware of it, but you're not part of it because you're too young, you're a kid. So by the time I became, and women of my generation became politically and socially active, it seemed that feminism was over and that we had won. And that's a hard message to get across if you were sort of born at a different point in time. But if you were born in 1963, by the time you were in high school, it sort of felt like, great, thank you very much. The feminists came in, they did some work, I can go to college wherever I want, I can have whatever career I want, I'm done. And so as a result of this, I think that most women of my generation, compared to women who were born only 10 years earlier than us, tended to disdain feminism as we were growing up. And it wasn't because, at least speaking personally for the moment, it wasn't because we actively pulled back and said, let me think about feminism. Is it good or bad? It's just that it felt like it was over and that it really was our parents', it was our mother's fight. And you all are young enough to, I think, probably realize you're just not that interested in the things your parents fought for, right? Because you want to fight your own battles and push for the next victory. So I think generationally, we tended to move away from feminism. Again, not because we thought it was bad, it just wasn't our fight. What also led into this, and this is a little bit more complicated, is that a lot of what we were hearing about feminism was not very attractive. Because if you were hearing about feminism as a kid, just listening to whatever you heard on television, you got the media distorted view of feminism. So what you tended to get was this cartoonish vision in which all feminists were angry, they all hated men, and they spent all their time burning their bras. None of which was actually true. And I've had several of the older feminists remind me, they didn't even burn any of the bras at the Miss America pageant. It was a rumor that got started and has stayed around for 50 years. But if you're 12 and you're watching this, you just absorb it as truth. And so, growing up, I sort of thought, ugh, I don't want to be a feminist. That's not who I am. And instead, what I saw coming through the media, and what in some ways I sort of equated with feminism, was a very different vision. I'm sorry, I'm hoping I'm pressing the right button here. Oh, there we go. This is what I saw. I saw Charlie. Now, you all, at least all the students in the room, are too young to recognize this ad. But if you show it to women my age and older, I'm seeing all the slightly older women shaking their heads. This ad was everywhere in the mid-1970s. And it really captured the sense of this era because this was what we thought we were going to be. We were going to be the Charlie girl. And who is the Charlie girl? Well, in this particular version, it's Shelley Hack, who actually goes on to become one of Charlie's angels. But who is she just sort of demographically? She is, as the text says, gorgeous, sexy, young. Who doesn't want to be that, right? Gorgeous, sexy, young. These are good words. She's clearly beautiful. She's also clearly working, right? She's not a stay-at-home mom. She's a working woman. She's elegantly dressed. She always has the briefcase sort of in the background. And in several of the ads have attractive men, and several of the ads have very beautiful little children. So without saying much more than gorgeous, sexy, young, what the ad is clearly conveying is that this is what a working mother's life is like. You go out, you look beautiful, you leave your child somewhere, the briefcase shows up, the men show up. This is good, right? Who would not want this image? And this is to a generation that earlier had grown up on the Brady Bunch. So which do you want to be? You want to be Charlie, right? And of course, right around the same time, sorry, this is why you should check these things before you come up here, Charlie's Angels comes out. So Charlie was a big thing in the mid-1970s. But again, this is very hard for you all to remember. We didn't have cable, right? So all there were 3 channels, 2, 4, 7, no remote, you just turn the dial. Everybody watched Charlie's Angels. These were working women, right? They were working in their bikinis and killing people. This is what professional life was supposed to be like. this is a very attractive model of what a working woman's life somehow is like. And it's not because somebody pulled you aside and said, listen, dear, this is what it'll be like when you enter the workforce. This was just what you were picking up through the media. And so without, I don't mean to trivialize this too much, but I think what happened as a result was that women of my generation sort of intuitively grew up saying, don't want to be a feminist, because they burn their bras and they're kind of unhappy all the time. Want to be Charlie, which means want to be attractive, want to be working, want to have children but not really think about it, want to have men. And it's a very, very seductive image. And we kind of fell for it, generationally speaking. And to be a little bit more specific, I think women of my generation, and to some extent I think still women of your generation, kind of grow up believing not only that we can have everything, but that it will all just kind of come to us rather naturally. And I think when I look back at this period of time, I think what happened was that women of my generation, without meaning to, because nobody sat down and decided to make this happen, but we actually privatized feminism. We're also the generation that brought you Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, so privatization was sort of a common theme. Rather, we took what had been very much a collective call to social action, which was what feminism was really about. It was about changing the world. It was about civil rights. It was about equality. We turned it inwards and made it about Charlie. We made it about a personal quest for perfection rather than being about social goals. We were the ones who made it about having it all. That's not what the early feminists were saying, but that's what we heard, and that's how we interpreted it. In addition, and this point's a little bit more subtle, but I think it's really crucial, we took the older expectations that women had always had, and rather than getting rid of them or eliminating some, we actually kept all of the old ones and added more. So rather than liberating women from a series of confining expectations, we upped the ante on all the things that women were supposed to do. Because our mothers and our grandmothers' generations had had these very confining expectations that you will get married, you will be a good housekeeper, you will have children, you will be a good mother. We didn't get rid of any of those. Instead, we added to them and we said, oh, and by the way, you'll look like this, and you'll be in the workforce, and you'll wear a bikini, and we ratcheted up without getting rid of any of the older sets of expectations. And the result of that is what I call in the book the Wonder Woman myth. Because we created this myth that you would be perfect, that you would do everything, and you would do it all well. And I just want to give you one very recent example of what I'm calling the Wonder Woman myth. And I just find it so poignant that it's worth taking a moment to discuss. And it's this woman, Marion Bartoli. So some of you may remember, Marion Bartoli won the women's singles championship at Wimbledon this summer. So a massive achievement. This is a woman, she's 28, she's been playing tennis since she was 6. So at the very peak of her professional success, it will never get better than winning Wimbledon for the first time. She goes on for her first major interview, and the BBC commentator, the BBC, this is not a slack news operation, the BBC commentator who's interviewing her says, well, is it true that when you were young, your father really pushed you to practice so hard because he looked at you and said, well, she's never really going to be a looker? It's just horrifying. So here you are in a moment that has nothing to do with your physical attractiveness. And your looks are being made the topic of inquiry. I think this is something that women face every single day of their lives in ways that men don't. So the good news is that women like Marion Bartoli can compete at Wimbledon and can get the interest that men's sports used to have. The bad news is that they're still being valued for their looks, in addition to being evaluated for all of the other things that they do professionally. So let me just leave that example out there. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is I want to take you through 3 sets of examples. The way the book works is I trace through the narrative of a woman's life. So the book, after a historical chapter, it looks at girls and how we raise girls and what kinds of expectations I think we as society is putting on girls and young women. Then it looks at body image. and how issues around body image, I think, are fundamentally different for women still than they are for men. It looks at sex, which is a really painful chapter to write. It looks at marriage, it looks at babies, it looks at housekeeping, it looks at the workplace, it looks at aging. So it really tries to follow through the arc of a woman's life. We don't have a lot of time, so I just want to touch on 3 of these issues, which are captured in 3 different chapters. And I've chosen them somewhat at random, but I just thought they might be nice to touch upon. The first is beauty and body image. The second is marriage and how it has and has not changed. And the third is housework, which you all might be a little young for, but you can probably, sort of imagine it. So let me start by talking about beauty. And I don't suspect I have to argue too hard to convince people in this room, or pretty much any room, that we as a society still remain totally obsessed with women's bodies, and with women's bodies as subjects of perfection and perfectibility. If you go back to any of the earlier feminist works, this was one of the most important themes, that we had to stop society's obsession with women's bodies, and we had to move beyond beauty as a standard to embrace other kinds of standards for women. Well, does anyone in this room think that we've pulled that off? No. If anything, and I would argue this pretty easily, we have instead, once again, upped the ante for beauty as a standard by which women are evaluated. So go to Rosie's at the corner, pick up any women's magazine, and what's it about? It's about beauty. And we now have a beauty standard that applies not just to sort of women your age, who've always been sort of the archetypal beautiful era. You're supposed to look like you're 22 until you're 92, so far as I can tell. Particularly in this city, you're not allowed to have a wrinkle. You're not allowed to gain weight. One is supposed to, or assumed to be, beautiful throughout the entire course of her life. And one of the things I do in the book, and some of you may have seen the glamour piece that excerpted it, was I just sort of counted up how long it takes me, not to look like a model, which I never will, but just kind of to show up for work in the morning. It takes me a lot longer than it takes my husband. And he uses a lot of hair product. But even so, that's about all he has to do. And just if you think about what the standards are, again, not for a model, just for a woman who's a lawyer or a doctor or a professor, there are standards that apply that actually are a major constraint on women's time and energy and income. It's not a bad thing, but I think it's something that we have to be aware of. And what is a bad thing, as in the Marion Bartoli story, we see this with Hillary Clinton constantly, is when people are conflating their assessment of women's qualifications with their assessment of women's beauty. I was talking about this topic recently with someone who mentioned that she had just gone to an exhibit at one of the museums that included several corsets, things women used to wear 200 years ago to make themselves more attractive. And she was commenting sort of somewhat flippantly, isn't it great that we don't have corsets anymore? And then her companion said, if you stop and think about it, maybe it was easier when women had corsets. Because if you think about it, you didn't actually have to work very hard if you wore a corset, right? It may have been painful, but you put it on and you were done with. Now the expectation is that we're going to retain corset-like bodies without the help of the corset. So what do you have to do instead? It's diet, it's exercise, which is arguably much harder than putting on a corset. So I will just throw that out there. I'm not going to argue this point too much, but I think it's interesting that in our so-called liberation, we in fact may have made it harder for women to achieve standards of beauty, because that woman in the corset has essentially the same shape as the woman, sort of, you pick any model and they're going to have more or less that same shape, but without the advantage of any kind of mechanical intervention. So let me turn and talk about marriage. Again, you all are a little bit young for this, but let me throw the argument out nevertheless. And the marriage chapter was one of the more interesting ones to write in the book, because there's not that much written about marriage, interestingly, in sort of cultural studies or feminist history. And if you just take it sort of at the sort of broadest level, marriage should have disappeared as a social institution. Marriage is essentially an economic contract. If you go back and you look at marriage throughout history, if you look at the original marriage ceremonies in the Jewish tradition, is actually quite interesting because it is actually a contract. Christian, there's several more variations, but it's essentially an economic transaction that the family is giving away their daughter to her husband in exchange for something. Land, cows, sheep, a dowry, but it's an economic transaction. And what the woman is giving is her virginity and the promise to have children. And in many cultures, if a woman didn't produce children, the marriage could be annulled, because that was the deal. Well, thankfully, we're way beyond that now. We don't enter into marriage, in virtually all cases, in this country at least, as an economic bargain. So why are we all still getting married? Why, interestingly, has same-sex marriage taken over in such a huge way, following essentially the same social conventions, which make really no sense in a same-sex union? We have actually fetishized the white wedding in a quite remarkable way, given that it's really a vestige of something that doesn't exist. The other thing we've done, and I'm going to sound horribly cynical saying this, but I think it's true and interesting, we've added a brand new ingredient into the marriage contract, and that's love, which is a good thing, but it's also ratcheting the expectations up. Because way back when, love had nothing to do with marriage. It was a social and economic bargain. And it was very clear what both parties to the contract had to do. Now we've thrown this really messy thing called love into the bargain, and it actually ups the ante again. I was thinking about this last night, and I stumbled onto something that I'd never crossed my mind before. But there's a beautiful little instance of this on Broadway. If you remember, I'm sure at least some of you have been in this play, Fiddler on the Roof, right? So there's this wonderful scene where Tevye, the father, the traditional father, is sort of confused over the fact that his daughter wants to marry someone she loves. And he doesn't know quite what to do with this. And trying to be a modern-ish guy, he goes to his wife of 25 years, Goldie, and he says, "Goldie, do you love me?" And she comes back, I won't sing it because I can't sing. She says, "Do I what?" And he says, "Do you love me?" And her answer, which I'll read to you, is she says, "Do I love you? For 25 years, I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house, given you children, milked the cow. After 25 years, why talk about love right now?" And it just captures something. This captures the change. Because what Tevye is asking, and what we've asked as a society, is you don't give up any of the other stuff. So I've been married for 25 years. I've washed your clothes, I've cooked your meals, I've cleaned your house, I've given you children, I've run to the corner to buy the milk, and I love you. And we've actually added to the bargain here in very complicated ways. I certainly would be the first to say that adding love into the marriage equation is exactly what you want to do, and it's crucial. But we need to just pull back for a second and say, maybe this is why we're fetishizing weddings to such a big extent, because we've made marriage much harder, because we haven't gotten rid of the older expectations, and we've added this new ingredient. And at the risk of sounding hopelessly middle-aged, I think for your generation, what makes this even more complicated is that if you buy into what at least I hear are the dominant social norms of hookup culture, what we're essentially expecting young women to do is to be carefreely promiscuous for 10 or 15 years of their lives, and then somehow to stumble into this wonderful monogamy for the rest of your lives. That's hard. Enough said. All right. So let me turn finally to talk about housework. And again, hopefully, none of you are doing too much housework these days. Although we do hope you clean your dorm rooms. Looking at Jean Hickson here. But once again, if you go back to some of the older feminism, and particularly Betty Friedan, who's absolutely explicit on this point, women were supposed to be liberated from doing the housework. The core of Friedan's argument is that women have to stop polishing their floors so they can go out and actually do real things and have a real impact in the world. We were supposed to move away from washing clothes and cooking meals so we could have professional, fulfilling, personal lives. I would argue that none of that has actually happened. That in fact, rather than women, and to some extent men, moving away from doing housework, we're actually doing more housework. And we are doing housework to a much higher, almost surreal level of expectations. So what women today expect their homes will look like and be like and feel like actually takes many more hours than their mothers or their grandmothers were expected to do. And if you want to get proof of this, once again, go to Rosie's, pick up any of the shelter magazines on the stand, and look at what you're supposed to be whipping up for dinner every night. Look at what your bathrooms are supposed to look like. Look at what your bedrooms are supposed to look like. These are things that take hours and hours and hours of work every week to pull off. So just because it's sort of the fall, autumn time of year, I just pulled a couple of random photos, but I think they are telling. Do-it-yourself Halloween costumes, right? Well, again, sounding elderly, when I did Halloween, you went to the drugstore and you bought a mask. Done. It was really easy. Now, if my kids are trick-or-treating, thankfully my children have grown up now, I'm supposed to be making these creations. These are really, really hard to do. If you are working at a law firm or an investment bank, or you don't have time to be sewing the robes, right? And yet somehow that's the expectation. When you're done with that, you should be making the magic holiday cupcakes. Because if you don't bring the magic holiday cupcakes to the bake sales, which so far as I can tell now occur weekly at every school your child attends, you're the bad mother. So on your way to your meeting or your conference call or your international trip, you've got to be whipping up little witch cupcakes. And then finally on your weekend, doing the bird feeder because you're taking care of the birds in addition to the class parties and the Halloween cupcakes. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. Pull up Real Simple magazine, which just has the gall to call itself Real Simple, because everything in there is really hard to do, and I can't do it. And yet, again, it's easy to laugh at this stuff, but if this becomes the dominant social norm, and you don't do this, you feel bad. And again, I'm older than all of the students here in the room, but one of the things I just hear all the time from women, whether they're working or not working, or mothers or not mothers, or married or not married, or straight or not straight, is guilt. The guilt that somehow they haven't done what they were supposed to do. Because what they were supposed to do, or what they felt like they were supposed to do, was everything. And nobody can do that. So let me just end, as these things are always supposed to end, by saying, all right, what do we do? How do we fix this mess that we've gotten ourselves into? And I actually don't think it's all that hard. I mean, there's some problems out there, Syria, where you look at it and you say, oh my God, I just have no idea how we get out of this. This one, at least in theory, is not that hard to unravel. What do we need to do? We explicitly have to give up on perfection. At every moment in the day, at every opportunity, and I know this is really hard in a context like Barnard's, rather than constantly focusing on how perfect you are or how less than perfect your friends might be, go for something a little less than perfection. This is something I've really tried to do in the book. I'm kind of terrified of it because I've put a lot of my personal stories out there, but I am trying to get the message across that nobody's perfect. All of us make choices. All of us are bad at some things. All of us have body parts we don't like and pieces of our family story that we don't like and mistakes we've made. And not that we need to wear all of our dirty laundry on our sleeves, but we need to be more honest. I think particularly women who've been successful in saying, here's where I screwed up. Otherwise, we're selling you all a bill of goods, and we need to stop doing that. Related to that, and this is something you can all start just thinking about, not today, but over the course of the next few years, think about what areas of your life really matter to you. What do you really want to be good at? What do you really enjoy doing? Where do you want to put your energies? And then, and this is the crucial second part, where else are you going to pull back? So if you're really going to focus on X, you've got to stop doing less of Y. Or you have to do Y less well. You have to give up on Y. You have to let somebody else take care of Y. And that's a really crucial distinction and set of decisions to make. Related to that, I think all of us, both as individuals and as society, we have to understand that life is about trade-offs. I think men understand this more naturally, perhaps because they haven't been subject to the same kind of massive shifts over the past few generations. So if the man's going to give a major presentation at work tomorrow, he's not going to try and play baseball with his kids tonight or mow the lawn. He's just sort of more intuitively say, that's got to wait, I got to do this. Women tend to try and do it all. So even if the presentation is tomorrow, they want to make sure the kitchen's clean before they go. I was talking to a TV producer this morning, and she confessed that before calling me to do this interview, she'd spent an hour cleaning her kitchen before the housekeeper came. We all do this. We really need to stop doing that. We also need to recognize, and this one is more provocative, but I throw it out there, and it's a fairly big argument in the book. We have to realize that biology matters. One of the mistakes that I think feminism did make was that it sort of tried to push biology over to the side, arguing that women really needed to be seen as the same as men. And I can understand historically why people made that argument, but I think it's done us a disservice, because women biologically are different than men. Those biological differences are really not relevant. In most cases, they are relevant once children enter the picture. Because right from the first moment, as soon as a woman has a baby, if she's hoping to go back to work, her life is different than a man's who's just become a father. And I had this conversation, it was fascinating to me, with same-sex couples, where even if it's two women in a couple and one of them has the baby and the other doesn't, it affects her in a fundamentally different way, because having a baby is actually a big deal. It doesn't destroy your life by any stretch, but it affects things differently. And the workplace doesn't recognize that, and women tend to not to recognize that, and men just don't want to think about it. And yet it has to be at least part of the conversation, although it is admittedly an awkward one. But unless we recognize that fact, we're actually never going to fix the workplace issues. Because that, just statistically we know, where women tend to fall off the work track is after they have babies, particularly after the second child. We also crucially, and this is another big argument of the book, we have to bring men into the conversation. Right now, if you go to women's networking events or so-called diversity events, there's only women there. And that's never going to solve the problem, because if women are always off in a corner by themselves networking, the guys are running the world next door. So we need to bring the guys into the into the diversity conversations and make sure that women aren't spending too much time just in women's networking groups, because they become ghettos really quickly. Most men I know now, whether from personal interest or because they're running corporations or organizations for whom this matters, they want women to succeed. They just don't know how to make it happen. So each and every one of you will have a million opportunities in your life to help the men in positions of power make it easier for women. You just need to tell them. And you need to bring them into the conversations, invite them into the rooms. Do it particularly with young men before they've gotten too embedded in their own careers and their lives. We also need, and this really brings the argument full circle, for me at least, we need, I think, to go back to the earlier goals of feminism. Because feminism, in the incarnation that I sort of missed, was really about liberating women. It's a word that's fallen off of our vocabularies, and it's a crucial word. Feminism wasn't supposed to tie women to making Halloween costumes and bird feeders. It wasn't supposed to tie women to another more constraining set of expectations. It was supposed to free women, to give them the opportunity to make their own choices. It was supposed to give women as a group civil rights, reproductive rights, the ability to fight for broader social goals. We need to get away from this personal focus on, am I having it all and doing it well, to what can we as a group of concerned people, women and men, do to make the world a better place. And we need to go back to those social goals, reminding ourselves along the way that this was supposed to be fun. We were supposed to find joy in this. And if you're spending your lives beating yourselves up to try and achieve some illusory goal of having it all or being perfect, you're blowing it. Because you need to go back and think about what this was supposed to be and how, again, as individuals and as a group, we can find a little bit of happiness, a little bit of joy, and bring everyone along with us towards, hopefully, a happier place. So let me stop there, and I would love to hear any questions or comments or thoughts, criticisms you might have. We have some mics, so if you wouldn't mind just going up to the mic, would love to hear your thoughts.
Hi. So in your book, you talk a lot about how women don't have to have it all, and that's an unfair expectation. So does that conflict in any way with your position here at Barnard, which is an extremely competitive women's liberal arts college?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one that we as administrators and you as students have to constantly struggle with. Because I don't think either Dean Hinkson or I or anybody else ever stands up at the front of the room and says, each and every one of you has to be perfect. And yet somehow you're hearing that. You're expecting that. And I don't think that's Barnard specific. I think you'd find it at any of the other elite colleges, for better and worse. So I think the struggle is for us to make it okay for you to realize that you don't have to do everything. You shouldn't be doing everything. And then you need to legitimize that amongst yourselves.
Yeah. That's a great answer, but also specifically, I guess, within incoming freshmen for high schoolers who are applying to colleges, there's such a huge focus on really doing it all.
Right.
How would you address that?
Yeah, and I have a little paragraph in the book that I hope you'll have a chance to see where suddenly I just began sort of ranting, and I kept it as a rant in the book, whereas I said, when you apply to colleges, we really don't need to hear that you've started 4 NGOs before you've turned 18, and you've been the captain of 42 separate varsity teams. What we're really looking for is who you are. Tell me you have a passion. Tell me you're in love with something. Tell me you've really, given your chunk of your life to pursue something that you care about. And that's actually how we look at lots of things, but we don't look for perfection. And I think somehow, and the we here is not just Barnard, but it's all of the colleges, I think we have a responsibility to get that across. I say this at every opportunity I have. We're not looking for perfect people. We're looking for real people. And somehow we have to try and get that message across to the high schoolers because, as you all know, you're killing yourselves to get into college. And that doesn't do you or us any good.
Thank you.
So I have
Yes,
a question.
hi.
Hi, President Spar. So I was just wondering what got you interested in, what got you to write this book? Like what made you decide to write this book?
Okay, this is a great question. Thank you. So I as I indicated in my words, I didn't study feminism in college, even though I was a political science major and have a PhD in political science. I kind of never read feminist theory. I sort of traipsed into the working world, sort of imagining my life would be like Charlie. I really didn't have any interest in being part of the women's groups or any of that stuff. And it was only later in my life when I all of a sudden, and it really was sort of all of a sudden, began to notice that I was the only woman left standing. That many of my college friends, female friends, had left the workforce. That most of the women who started with me at HBS as faculty members were gone. Most scarily, that many of my students at Harvard Business School, who were really smart, accomplished, ambitious women, were not staying in the workforce. And I started just wondering, as one does, what's gone wrong? Right around that same time, I was also, because I was the only woman left standing, I was increasingly being asked to work at the help people think about the women's problem at Harvard or wherever it was. And I became increasingly convinced that there was a women's problem. So I actually started working on this book before I came to Barnard. And the title of the book at that time was Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist, which was a title that all of the publishers told me I couldn't possibly use. But it actually captures a large part of what the book is about. And it really is, that's the personal piece. Talking as somebody who didn't think feminism was important and realizing later on, perhaps too late, that my life as a woman and my friends' lives as women had unfolded fundamentally differently than men's. And I wanted to try and understand that.
Okay, and just one more thing. Just a comment, do you think that maybe working is better than being a housewife? Because I feel like I've talked to a bunch of my guy friends and my girlfriends, and the guys would always say, well, what's wrong with being a mom? And why does the world make it seem like being a housewife being a housewife does not mean that you're taking all your potential and you're not doing the best that you can, and being a working mom is like the better option.
And I think, and I don't mean to sound trite here, I think people, first of all, are incredibly lucky if they have the ability to make that choice. Most working mothers are working mothers because they have to be working mothers, and that's a really crucial point. if you do have the choice, I think women really should be trying to do what feels right for them. And one of the things that women do a bad job at is not legitimizing other women's choices. So one of the things you'll see, and again, you're all too young, but anyone who's old enough to have sat on a playground with their kid knows this little scenario that gets played out a million times. You know, oh, do you work? Oh, do you stay at home? There's a lot of judging going on. And I think if women want to be home with their kids and that's what they want to do, that's exactly what they should be doing. They should be aware of the fact that it's going to be hard to get back into the workforce if that's what they want to do. They just need to be aware of that. Women who want to work and have kids should be aware of the fact it's going to be really, really hard. But if that's what they want to do, that's what they should do, and we should stop judging each other.
But one is not better than the other.
No.
Right? Okay.
No.
Right,
But you shouldn't choose one of these because somebody else is pushing you to do it.
All right.
You should actually make a choice.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So a lot of these problems are problems of women of extreme privilege.
Yep.
And I'm just curious about the way that you, first of all, whether you chose to sort of target a very niche group of women when you were writing this book, and how and whether you deal with issues of race and class with all of these issues of perfection.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I know it's one I'm going to be getting a lot. The book is largely about white women, women of privilege, and straight women. And it's that way because that's who I am. And I made the decision early on in writing the book that was really what, for me, was the only honest route to take. If I had tried to include chapters, and this is what it's like to be poor and black, I would have had to write a very different book. And so I decided to be what felt honest to me and say, this is the world that I've experienced. And it is a very elite world. I'm not struggling to feed my family, thank goodness. But I think it's worth at least conveying these problems, even from the uber elite, if that's what most of us in this room are. Because I think what I've heard, at least in the early sort of versions of this, which has been very reassuring, is that women who are struggling more, they feel more validated to realize that even the women who are wealthier and have had more opportunities are struggling too, that we're not any more perfect. We may have higher levels of education, but we ain't perfect either.
And sorry, just one more.
Go ahead.
This is just, I'm curious about your personal opinion of whether you think that the goals of feminism shift depending on what social strata you come from or what race you are.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I say this as someone who's very much an interloper into this area theoretically, I think as feminism has evolved, there's been many, many sort of subgenres within feminism. And some of the subgenres agree on overarching things and some of them don't. And sort of tie back to the last question, I think at the end of the day, you don't want to get too personal about it so that feminism just becomes me, but we do need to realize that people's lives are going to play out in fundamentally different ways. But just one point on this, I wrote a related article in Newsweek about a year ago, and I received a ton of mail. And the letter that stuck with me the most was from a young woman, so she's much closer to your age than my age. She's a Coast Guard officer off the coast of Alaska, so she lives a fundamentally different life than I do. And yet she wrote, "Your article described my life perfectly." I'm like, how's that possible? You're on a boat. but the issues about equality in a marriage, she was struggling with whether or not to have children. I think those issues do transcend race and class and gender to some extent.
Thank you.
Shoot over there.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I think this is incredible. The question I had, you talked a lot about having children and the choice of having children and what it is to be a mother. I was wondering, what do you think, feel about those women for whom having a children is not a choice, and the way that inherently affects the perception of your femininity and value as a woman? And do you think we're past the place of a woman being only as valuable as her ability to reproduce?
It's a really good, they're all great questions. I have a chapter or a subchapter in the book that I call Pregnancy Porn, which I like as a title, but it's also, I think, quite important. We fetishize pregnancy in a way that I think is quite detrimental. And I think it's worth, all of you just giving some thought to before too much longer. We really do still value women as producers of children. You know, despite everything else women do and that we're assessing them for, again, pick any magazine off the shelves. I mean, how many times has Jennifer Aniston been pregnant? I mean, the woman's been pregnant for 15 years, as far as I can tell. But, you know, there seems to be a sense that unless she produces a child, her life will not be complete. And I've been very lucky to have children in my life, but I don't think it's what defines me. And I think, once again, I've had a number of women, in response to sort of the last question, say, you know, what's the book, this kind of book for single women? I couldn't, or women, single, childless women. That wasn't the book I could write, but I think somebody should write that book, because I think that's yet again another kind of choice that we need to validate. And I know, you know, it's one of the sort of, you know, ugly bits of truth out there. If you look at women who really have achieved the highest levels of power, particularly women who are a little bit younger, many of them, if not most of them, don't have children. So they made that choice. And I think we need to validate that and say it doesn't reflect on your sense of worth to not have been a mother.
I think, maybe I'll just clarify a moment. Sorry to keep taking up time. I'm asking specifically about women for whom they don't make it a choice, women who can't have children.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And the level of like pity that comes with that,
Right,
when you
right.
say that to another woman, they say, oh, your life is so incomplete,
Right,
you poor barren soul.
Yeah, no, I wrote my last book on reproductive medicine. It's called The Baby Business. So this is something I've given a lot of thought to. This is, again, another expectation that we've lobbed onto women. If you go back 40 or 50 years ago, before the emergence of reproductive medicine, 15% of women are infertile. That's just the natural rate of infertility. So 50 years ago, if you were infertile, you just kind of moved on. You know, sometimes you adopted, most times you didn't, and it was not actually that much of a stigma in American society. Again, tragically now, because we have assisted reproductive technologies, we've raised the expectation that of course you'll do IVF. Of course you'll get a surrogate. Of course you'll use donor eggs. And I'll go to a little bit on my soapbox. These things can be dangerous, and they actually don't work. The success rates are not nearly as high as the media would have you believe. So women need to be very careful about not jumping on those particular bandwagons if it's not where they want to be, or if it doesn't work. And also, as my third daughter, many people know this, was adopted. That's still a really, really, really good option that sadly has somewhat fallen out of favor because people jump so easily to assisted reproduction. It's the end of my sermon. All right.
Thanks so much for being here. This is super exciting. I guess my question is, like, as all of us sort of head into the workplace, think about having kids, what are the sorts of things and decisions that we can make with our employers in terms of like negotiating and fighting for the things that our employers can do to maybe make our lives easier and make us, you know, allow us to work and also take care of our kids, and also sort of this conversation about people not wanting to hire maybe people of our age or people with an engagement ring on our finger because we might be having a baby in 2 years, and sort of like how do we balance that, I guess?
Yeah. Again, really good set of questions. I mean, the first thing I think, just to feel somewhat better about, is most sophisticated employers today, they don't engage in that kind of bad behavior anymore. I mean, one of the things I hear constantly in the city is, how can I get more women in the pipeline? To which I constantly say, take the 1 train, come to Barnard, and recruit here. But employers are very conscious of not having enough women. So I think in general, it actually does still work a little bit to your advantage to be a smart, hardworking young woman, because employers are looking for that. And I think they'll, you know, overlook the engagement ring on your finger. After that point, so once you've gotten in the front door, I think, first of all, it's really important to think about, as much as you can at this point in your lives, what kind of careers are going to give you the kind of flexibility that you want. Because it is easier to juggle life and work at some jobs than others. It just is. And again, that's not always very popular to say, but I think it's really important to say. And if you look, medicine's an interesting field. There's a lot of women doctors, a lot of very successful women doctors. Over the 30 or 40 years that women have been in medicine in serious numbers, they've shifted in terms of what subfields they're in. Turns out it's easier to be a female emergency room physician because you actually have regular hours in emergency practice. Somewhat ironically, it's harder to be an OBGYN because the babies come at, you know, when the babies come. So we've actually seen women initially, there were a lot of women in OBGYN, they've actually shifted out. Law is another really interesting one. If you're going to be a corporate lawyer, it's hard, particularly, well, actually throughout your career because you're billing hours. Look at women judges, though. No less prestigious, there's a lot of women judges because judges actually have regular hours. So even within fields, I think you can't go in and put all of the onus on the employer. Think about where in the field it will be easier. One of the reasons I went into academia was I knew I could control my schedule, which I still do. You know, I work hard, but I know at the end of the day I'm judged on my output rather than how many hours I'm sitting behind a desk, and that's given me crucial flexibility. And then in terms of employers, the first thing you can do is be good at your job. And it sounds pat to say, but if you're good at what you do, they're going to want to keep you regardless of what it takes. And then the second thing as you go through your career is make sure that you have the kind of relationship that you can go to your boss and not ask for everything. You know, I want to take 6 years off and come back at exactly the same pay. But, you know, this is what I need. I need Friday afternoons. I need Monday mornings. And again, if the boss wants to keep you because you're valuable, they will, in most cases, do what it takes to accommodate. Again, presuming you're in one of those careers where you're not, billing hours is tough. But most other careers, they want to be flexible. You just have to help them think through what works for you.
Great,
All
thank
right,
you.
let me take one last one.
Hi, thanks. So I guess I just wanted to ask, I'm really terrified to make the decision of what to pull back on, and I equally want a career and a family, and I'm terrified of making the decision of, well, if I have one child and not two, is that pulling back, or is that, you know, like putting this child in an only child situation, and that's awful for her, and then what if I pull back in my career, and yada yada. But these are the things that I think about, and I'm 20. I guess I'm asking you, how do you know what to pull back on? Because I agree that I can't do it all even now, but I just don't know where to even begin with that process.
Yeah. First of all, I don't think there's one right answer. Clearly, there's not one right answer for everybody. So what works for you is going to be different than what works for you. I also don't think you can explicitly make these decisions when you're 20. I think you can make part of them. I think you can think about, you know, if you know that at least in an ideal world, you would like to have both a work life and a family, then choose a career or subfield within a career that at least opens that possibility of flexibility. And I'm not talking about necessarily a 15-hour week, but, you know, maybe, you know, career A, where you'd have to work 90 hours a week, is not the right one for you. So, you know, give yourself the possibility of some kind of flexibility. And it's way too early to think about whether you want one kid or two kids or whatever, but start even now learning to say no. And learning to say no to things you like. We're all good at saying no to things we don't like, but figure out what are the parts of your life that you're just not willing to give up. And what are the parts of your life that even though you like them, you can come back a little bit. And I think that's a pretty, you know, don't make yourself crazy doing this, but you're all busy. You know, think about, you know, I love this club, I can't give this one up. I really like this one. Maybe you have to cut back on that one. You know, maybe you'd love to get straight A's, but getting straight A's is going to come at the expense of your social life. B pluses are okay. Yeah, they're going to put that on the front page of the spec, right? President Spar says. But they are, you know, unless you're planning to go to a graduate school where you absolutely have to have A's. But starting to get comfortable, there's a certain kind of, you know, muscle memory there. Learning to say no and to, you know, to say no to things you like is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. And the earlier you develop that, the better. So let me end there, turn it back over to Nikki, and thank you all so much for being here and for your great comments.
Okay. Thank you so much, President Spar. That was wonderful. So I'm going to share some good news with you all. The publisher of President Spar's book is going to be gifting everyone in this room with a copy of the book, so you can go read it and be inspired. So that's wonderful news, and thank you so much. Am I passing it along? I'm sending you to the 2 gray tables for the books, yes. Okay, thank you so much.